Now we turn to the question of an arms race between the United States and Russia. Russia releasing a statement that they will no longer comply. They're terminating their membership to the Treaty on the Elimination of Intermediate Range and Shorter Range Missiles. Well, I'm joined by Dr. Kingsley Makhubela. How are you, Doc?
Good morning, Doctor.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, and thanks very much for always creating time. Just the ABCs for the purposes of our listeners. What is this treaty and what is its origins?
You know, Doctor, the full name of the treaty is called the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. The abbreviation is INF Treaty. This treaty was first negotiated in 1976, and it deals with it came as a result of the deployment of the Soviet SS-20 missile, which had a range of 4,700 to 5,000 kilometers, and the Western capitals raised serious concern about that. It falls just under the SALT Treaty 2 agreement. SALT Treaty 2 agreement, it limits the range of missiles that are starting from 5,500 kilometers. So if you look at the figure that I just gave you, it just falls outside that. And the SALT Treaty agreement has what it's called the Intercontinental Ballistic Missiles limitation. So that's a treaty that deals with this. But to put things in true context in terms of the INF Treaty, Doctor, on 20th of October 2018, President Trump announced that the United States was withdrawing from the treaty due to what he called the Russian non-compliance. And he then raised another reason to say the second reason related to the buildup of the Chinese military in the Pacific and South China Sea. So that's when he started this. But it was then formally the United States suspended the participation of the INF on the 1st of February 2019, and Russia the following day on the 2nd of February 2019 also suspended. And formally, the U.S. formally withdrew from the treaty on the 2nd of August 2019, and Russia then announced about 3 days ago, on the 4th of August, that it would no longer be bound by the treaty. That is how things happen in terms of the INF Treaty, Doctor.
And what is the significance, therefore, of these nuclear powers entering treaties on the first, and what are the implications of them withdrawing from such agreements?
You know, the implications, it undermines the international law-based treaties. Means every treaty could just be repudiated and operate outside the treaty. And given the fact that this treaty was negotiated over a long period of time to reach agreement, it limits the use of nuclear warheads. It limits the launch in terms of the ballistic missile, the cruise missile. And it limits the certain range. And as a result of that treaty, Doctor, there has been a lot of nuclear weapons that have been decommissioned. I mean, the Russians, they decommissioned the SS-4, the SS-5, the SS-12, and so on. And the Americans have also decommissioned the BMG and so on. So there's been a lot of achievements in terms of this treaty in limiting the arms race, particularly the nuclear arms race that could have created certain challenges. Now, if you look at some elements of the treaty, it includes, inspection in terms of the compliance. You may have seen during the attack that Ukraine had on the Russian strategic bombers that were outside, that in terms of the treaty, those strategic bombers must be outside, available, and accessible through a satellite. When they are moved out, it raises serious challenges, and the United States does the same. That's why when the White Swan came to South Africa, the nuclear strategic bomber that they predate the Soviets, they had to announce the movement of the plane. So there are stringent rules that really govern the treaty that has helped during the most difficult time of the Cold War to manage any perception and so on. So moving out of the treaty, it raises serious challenges.
So, but part of the reasons which are advanced by Russia is that the United States, not only sort of suspended its compliance, but actually deployed the Typhoon and Dark Eagle missiles, for instance, in Germany. And the Russians have, as it were, read this as a direct provocation. Do they have grounds for that, or it was the sort of U.S.'s defense as that being a defensive act has legitimacy?
If you look at this treaty, some of the conditions that it puts, it does not include the deployment of a nuclear weapon by sea. That's why it includes the land-based deployment. And it goes on to, it actually takes some of the language from the SALT II treaty, because the SALT II treaty has to do with the limitation of arms. It has to do with the range limitation. If you look at the SALT I treaty, it has to do with, it focuses mainly on the number of nuclear weapons, warheads that countries must have. So technically, actually, the Russians have no basis to use that as an argument now. The Russians, because it's not covered by sea base in terms of the INF treaty. However, having said that, the Russians have a legitimate case if you look into the United States that has announced in 2019 that they are moving away from the treaty. They literally moved away from the treaty. And the Russians are quite correct to say they have taken time to try to persuade the Americans to go back to the treaty. Once the Americans ratify they are moving away from the treaty, the Russians have taken, since 2019 up to now, the Russians are only moving out of it. They've announced they won't abide by it now. So they've given enough chance to be quite fair to them. But the reason it cannot be because of this movement or the likely deployment of the submarines, because are not covered by that treaty, So that's where the challenge is.
And what they call the PRSM missile firing systems and the exercises that I think occurred in Australia, if I'm not mistaken, that there are modifications to these systems which are expected to exceed the range of 1,000 kilometers, as it were. And this is around 2005, because those exercises happened with the Australian crews. And this is like a thing that occurred this year. That means the United States has effectively deployed against the expected range restrictions. Is that at least grounds for provocation?
It is, operating outside the ground that have been stipulated in the treaty. It's a violation. That's why I'm saying the Americans are then saying, yeah, but the Chinese have a free range because the Chinese are not a signatory to the INF Treaty. And the balance of power in this case, it favors the Russians that are much more aligned to the Chinese. And that's why you may have seen the British, the American, and the Australian in what is called the AUKUS trying to come up with a totally different regime. But it still constitutes the violation of the treaty in terms of that. But now that the Americans, as of August 2019, have moved out of the treaty, they are not bound by it technically. So it's a free-for-all. And the biggest fear, Doctor, here is the proliferation of missile technology beyond that. And we started to see countries, for instance, during the recent war between Israel and Iran, you've seen the Iranians are possessing the supersonic missiles that are way beyond the range that is stipulated by SALT II treaty. So you'll see the proliferation. The Houthis are having the same. The Israelis are having the same access to that kind of missile technology. So it's really creating a big problem for international peace and security. If you get powers that are supposed to regulate and underwrite the process of peace and the development of nuclear weapons and or missile system are doing this, it creates a big problem for all of us.
Okay, and then why would China, because it looks like there were deliberate attempts to have them be signatories, a factor that the United States as well, you have indicated this, raises as an important dynamic that the Chinese are not signatories. But if the Chinese, being known for being in favor of international peace and security in relation to the stability thereof, why were the Chinese, in your speculation, not coming on the table?
If you look into the history of the treaty, I think by the time the treaty was conceived and the discussions took place between the Americans and the Soviet at that time, China was not a superpower that it is today. So the geopolitical dynamics have changed and the balance of forces have literally changed in favor of China. China has become the biggest power in the world. China has also developed what is called the sixth generation fighter jets, which the Russians and the Americans don't have a sixth generation. They're still operating on the fifth generation. So the technological development of the Chinese and military industrial complex has literally changed. In effect, it means now China has become a superpower, and this has to be an acknowledgement that China now is a superpower, and perhaps look at a treaty that would also bound the Chinese. But given the global shift of this geopolitical dynamics that we see, you're unlikely to see that kind of negotiation. Of course, it serves the Chinese also to operate outside any treaty. They are not seen to be violating any international obligation they may have signed because they operate freely out of this.
But there are claims that the United States may have called on China, or there were calls at least for a new treaty or China to be a signatory to the same treaty. And the Chinese were, as it were, non-cooperative. Is this the case? And I'm saying that taking into consideration China's own interest in global stability, why wouldn't they have accepted the invitation to be the signatories of the treaty?
You know, there have been challenges around the Pacific and the South China Sea and the movement that the Americans are having towards maybe the Filipinos, even in terms of their relations with the North Koreans and so on. So it raises the South Koreans, so to say. It raises serious insecurity. The behavior of the U.S. in terms of expansion. I mean, the U.S. has close to 7,000 military bases around the world. And that's what's causing concern to a lot of people. So if anyone is to discuss that, you are likely to have this discussion. And the seas now, Doctor, have become a big issue. I mean, I listened to your interview yesterday with Naeem from Mapungubwe around the strategic importance of the Simon's Town as a military nodal point, given what we are seeing. And I still hold the view that that's what is causing some of the tension. That's why you're seeing the tension around the Sudan, on the Port Sudan strategic location and to the Red Sea. So you're going to see some of this nodal point becoming points of contention and interest moving forward. So the Americans, quite honestly, they stated their interest in terms of that. That's why the argument around the Taiwan island, it's not much of the strategic economic importance. It's much more of the military strategic importance and the location of the area, how to access certain things. So that will become a dispute. And as long as this insecurity exists and this fear that the other one is trying to outplay the other one, you are likely to see this arms race building up.
So where to from here? What would a body, for instance, like the United Nations, have to say and do? And then NATO, on the other hand, how do you get these superpowers to de-escalate?
The United Nations would definitely not have a role in this. Remember, issues of peace and security are delegated to the Security Council. And the P5 members are divided. China is part of the permanent members. The Russians are permanent member. So is the U.S., France, and the United Kingdom. So as long as you have this division around dealing with issues of international peace and security, you are likely to see these challenges going on unabated. That's why if you look at the agenda of the G20 here, and credit to South Africa for this, South Africa has included issues of resolving conflict and dealing with these issues. And the absence of the American president here, if he doesn't come, would have an impact in terms of the global stand and the message that must be sent to all those who are involved in these intractable conflicts that we're seeing around the world. It would have been much better to get all the heads of state together outside their veto comfort zone to make a commitment in terms of international peace and security and see how they're going to work with everyone else. So I think there are different platforms that we should not despair or literally abandon them, but utilize them to try to persuade those who actually have more powers in terms of perpetuating and stopping conflicts to abide by the rules and save our world from the precipice that we're seeing. I mean, the biggest concern that all of us have now is the possibility of a third world war. And if you look at what is going on around the world, it's likely to be there. I'm glad today, Doctor, Steve Witkoff is in Moscow, is having a discussion with the Russians. And we hope that they will come up with a strong message, really, that will send not only to the market, but to all of us, that there's an intention to de-escalate the tensions around the world. And these two powers are really instrumental in doing that.
Could the United States be getting ready to impose its ultimatum on the Russian Federation regarding the Ukraine war? Because all these actions, when the Russian Federation does not comply with the United States ultimatum, is that the point at which some full-scale confrontation might happen or some form of it thereof?
You know, the ultimatum, I think it's a wrong choice that the Americans have used. Remember, in the ultimatum scenario, it's like a chess move. So the Americans have made a move to give an ultimatum. So they expect the Russians to comply, and the Russians are not complying, and they send an envoy. Sending that an envoy is an admission on the American side that actually the ultimatum would not work. because the ultimatum expires this Friday. And the Russians are unlikely to do that. Not unlikely, they are not going to do that. They've made it quite clear that no amount of ultimatum would intimidate them. The Trump administration has endeavored to try to stifle the Russian economy together with the European. They've used a hammer and anvil strategy where actually they push sanctions and use military that is going on in Ukraine against the Russian. I mean, 2 days ago, Doctor, the Russians have hit a huge military depot in western Ukraine. And the view is that the Americans have been sending weapons despite their communication that they are not sending weapons, and the Russians have been tracking this. Once the weapon landed in Russia, they went to bomb them. And that's why they use supersonic missiles to attack those. It's not, I mean, this is not yet verified. No one has accepted this. But the conventional wisdom coming out is that this is true. So there's a huge challenge around this. So these are issues that are playing themselves, but we hope that this Witkoff, and I think Witkoff has proven to be quite a very smart diplomat in terms of his negotiations with the Russians, that maybe he would come up with something that would de-escalate this tension that is building up between the U.S. and the Russians. And the coming to power of Trump, all of us had a view that he's much more approachable. He'll be able to discuss with Putin, and they'll be able to de-escalate the tension. So let's hope that something comes up positively.
And finally, Doc, the sort of big speculative point around the relationship of Trump and Putin was that Trump's coming into the administration was going to shift America's eye from escalating tensions with Russia, that the Americans' interest now is a full-scale dealing with China. And we would have seen this with the fallout, for instance, in the Oval Office with Zelensky, and some of the pronouncements by Foreign Secretary around NATO, and the fact that the United States would be withdrawing. These were initial sort of positions of this Trump administration. What could have gone wrong between the Russians and the administration of Trump such that things are now here?
You know, I think one thing that Trump has done, and he must be given credit for that, is to start opening lines of communication between the United States and Russia. And I think since he's been in office, there have been close to 3 or 4 telephonic discussions, and some of this have led into some level of de-escalation, so to say, even within the Ukrainian conflict. So that has worked much better. But I think there's too much pressure within the U.S. administration to take a hardline position, because if you look at people in Congress, they've always designated Russia as enemy number one, even though Russia, in terms of all purposes, occupies the center right in politics around the world. The Russians' politics are not to the left or center left, they are to the center right. They're almost in the same camp, but it's because always they've designated Russia as an enemy, and they are unable to move away from that designation and look at Russia as a partner to try to resolve this. You can go back to when Russia got association membership with NATO, and Russia wanted to participate in the global architecture of the security of Europe and so on. The Europeans have been very hesitant and resistant to really accommodate the Russians. So we don't know what's going to happen. But I think the best chance that we have now is because the lines of communication are open, and I hope they should be kept open. We are yet to see an envoy sent by the Russians to the Americans to also convey messages, including confidential messages. Because what we've been told, I think, is not the totality of what is being discussed. There are confidential things that are going on, and that's the nature of the beast between heads of state. There are certain things that are kept between themselves.
Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, thanks very much for always sharing your insights with us here on Power Talk, and It's always a pleasure to speak to you.
Thanks very much, Doctor. The pleasure is really mine.
That's it from us, Bantwana Benkosi. Let's keep a close eye on those escalating tensions that might explode into a full-scale war, leading us into World War III. We are keeping an eye as well on the claims by Taiwan that China plans to invade them. Very important. That will disrupt global trade massively. The implications are incalculable, taking into consideration how integrated the world is since the Cold War days or even since World War II. That's it from us, Bantwana Benkosi. Stay tuned for Power Lunch from me and the team here. Dintanda nonke makhaya.